la mesa, entonces tenemos una mesa un poquito más corta. Nuestro primer participante es Eduardo Brondicio, es catedrático de antropología, dirige el Centro de Análisis de Paisajes Socioecológicos y es Senior Fellow del Taller Ostrom de la Universidad de Indiana Bloomington. Brondicio ha entrelazado las ciencias agrarias, la antropología y el análisis geoespacial para abordar temas de interacción entre el ser humano y el medio ambiente desde la escala local a la mundial. Y nuestro segundo participante será Nikolai Alvarado, que es profesor adjunto del Departamento de Geografía y Ciencias de la Información Geográfica y codirector del colectivo de ciudades latinoamericanas y caribeñas de la Universidad de Illinois en Urbana, Champaign. Su investigación se centra en los urbanismos de los migrantes, la política de la calle, las relaciones migrantes-Estado y las construcciones raciales del cuerpo-espacio desde una perspectiva del sur global. Espero que sí. Muy bien. Bueno, pues le damos la palabra a Eduardo Brondicio. Adelante.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'll speak in English. We're learning in English. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a wonderful day to be here, and we appreciate the opportunity to meet Nikolai and to share this panel with you. What I prepared is an overview of migration and environment, and it's an overview. And I'll start with first with a global contextualization of some issues, and then move to the Amazon and talk about the emerging challenges of particularly indigenous peoples are facing the region and that are affecting not only migration, but also governance more broadly of indigenous lands. So let's see if I get a timer here so we can. All right. As I said, I'll give a global snapshot and broader than climate change, by the way, talk about the long history of and complex interaction between mobility and migration in Amazonia, the transforming landscape now, and some emerging challenge relate to that. So global context. One of the things that we've been learning only in the past very few years is the actual global importance of indigenous lands, indigenous knowledge, and indigenous practice for the environment more broadly. It's surprising because this map was done just a few years ago. We're in the process of updating it, and it changes completely the way we see their role in current global environmental issues. Before, I think the very fragmented knowledge about the distribution of indigenous people, and we've come to learn that over a quarter of the global terrestrial surface is managed or held in rights by indigenous people, right? And these are, if you count, still customary lands. These are just recognized land that we can trace on paper. If you count customary lands, if you count lands that are customary by a broader sense of local communities, which may involve or not indigenous communities, we're talking about over 50% of the global land surface. So it's a significant population distributed globally, and we are also starting to learn, as I said, their relevance as sort of the managers and protectors of the most ecologically, better place globally on different dimensions. So that has implication not only for biodiverse conservation, but the conservation of very large watersheds that feed population in urban areas in many regions, and significant, of course, for all the carbon budget of the planet, and also for restoration. So that's first a contextualization on that level of the gaining importance of that. At the same time, these are the populations that are literally at the very forefront of both climate problems, pollution, and pollutions of different kinds, right? And biodiversity pressures on biodiversity loss. So you have this dual situation that are now, sort of in place of playing this major role, is still marginalized in most of those negotiations, and at the same time confronting where the pressures are, the most strongest. I want to call attention to one particular change, that has a direct implication for migration and tends to be one of the most invisible topics, I think, taken for granted issues that affects both indigenous people and rural populations, and in some cases, some urban populations as well, which is the loss of employment in the broader sense of food production. And that includes agriculture, fishing, pastoralism, forest and agroforestry, and wild species decline, wild species production, and so forth. For indigenous people, this is central, as it is for rural populations. I mean, it's near 60% of indigenous peoples in a working age depend on job in the sectors, right? Now, what has happened in the past 30 years, the analysis that we published last year, there has been 200 million jobs, individual jobs lost in food production, which explains a lot of patterns of migration of indigenous, particularly to urban areas. We projected losses from now, actually from last 2020 to 2030, and it's accelerating even more to a projected 120 million individual jobs, which affects a lot of more people, right? These jobs have direct implication for many indigenous areas in different parts of the world. So a situation that still looks like, sort of reflecting right, decades and centuries of colonialism, where many indigenous people have been displaced or moved or migrated in many ways to urban areas, which in some cases is the dominant indigenous groups are in urban centers. In other areas, like in Africa, Asia and Africa, this is where we're going to see this fast-pacing loss in food production jobs. So it's expected that those areas and indigenous peoples in those areas, and of course rural communities, will have and will face significant change in migration patterns during the remainder of this decade, right? And this type of migration pattern, right, from indigenous lands to urban areas. So I want to call attention to that because that is a global pressure for some reasons that some regions have already seen. We have seen that in parts of Latin America, right? But some other regions are just starting to experience that. So you have whole generations of indigenous youth that are, and will be in the process of moving to cities of different kinds. I'm going to move to the Amazon and give a little bit of, sort of a sense of a regional perspective. I've been working in the region for over 35 years. I work on the ground in different parts of the area. And my own work itself, move it from working in rural areas, in riverine areas for many years, and to end up working in urban areas because I was basically following the people that are working, right? And following that sort of mobility and circulation and migration too. And then end up looking into the transformation of cities and the transformation of urban areas in the region, which is one of the most accelerated transformations globally, and one of the most precarious transformation globally. And nowadays, one of the most violent, for certain, the most violent region in Brazil, even compared to other urban areas in Brazil and in Latin America. So that's the kind of transformation here. Now, mobility and migration is part of the Amazonian history for millennia. And that's, what is changing is the nature and pattern and the ability of people to decide to move in the region. So when you look at the formation of urban centers and urban populations in the region in pre-Columbian times, they are marked by very large networks of interconnected centers with incredible amount of mobility between over very large regions. So the very configuration of the region is one that is sort of based on interactions of centers and mobility between centers for many regions. What happened since the European colonial arrival there was a process in which that concentration, which used to be along the main channel and along the main tributaries, almost completely disappears and moves away from the heads of the tributaries, leaving most of the Amazon basin in terms of the main tributaries and the main channels virtually empty from indigenous peoples. What happened is that process is a process of fragmentation, of course, of a genocide, and small of that typical image of the Amazon indigenous group that we have today comes from this period of the post-colonial expansion, not what the indigenous landscape that was there before, which is fragmented, small, isolated indigenous groups. That is part of that process. These groups, which form, today still of course, the rich landscape of indigenous Amazonia, re-encounter the national societies as after the 60s, you have, the government plans that still today sort of, it's cascading process in motion to create roads where then you start to come across again the indigenous people that fled the main channels all the way up, sort of to the north and to the south. So you have a sort of a re-encounter, and following that, there's a long history, of course, of migration from the southern Brazil and a lot of occupation of the region, but you have a major indigenous resurgence. One that sort of reoccupy and gain territorial rights at a very large scale, as you see. Right, and this resurgence that happens after the 80s and particularly after 1990s with the actual demarcation of indigenous lands at the scale that we see today is now facing other kinds of problems, right? Problems of enclosures and circumscriptions of this continuous process of development in the region. So what we have today is of course, a significant advance in the designation of territorial rights for indigenous groups. At the same time, we have a process where we see islands of indigenous lands that have been formed in large indigenous communities in urban areas. Right, so I just want to give this sort of larger perspective to put this, the topic that we're talking here, in as always part of Amazonian history. The other thing that is important is to recognize how diverse the indigenous populations of the Amazon are. And that has a lot of implications, for organization and for their having voice, or how do they confront the kinds of pressures that are today. So we have significant areas and significant, sort of groups, maybe in between 60 and 70 groups that are considered isolated, right, and are not organized as some other groups are, all the way, to, as I said, a large number of urban indigenous populations and resurgent Indians, populations that have sort of entered into a process of regain indigenous identity and rights. So it's a very diverse population, right? And that's a very important part of the story. When we talk about indigenous people in the Amazon, we need to consider that they are very diverse and, sort of organized in different ways and have different ability to confront the kinds of problems that we have there. Now, there's some also, important and good news in that sense. Significant increase in individuals recognized and, self-definition of indigenous groups just in the past 12 years. And also, as you're going to see in a second, a significant increase in the number of indigenous peoples living in indigenous areas, which reverted a trend, right? There was a long-term trend of sort of decreasing population within indigenous areas. Now we see that trend reversing. Now, I made this figure here just sort of to talk a little bit about it and the need, I think, to untangle a little bit migration and mobility, right? Because mobility is so intrinsic to the organization of indigenous groups in various ways, right? And it's important to consider that in its multiple forms and how it relates to migration itself. And here I'm considering migration, the sort of more permanent sort of relocation to other areas. But this is not a black and white sort of picture. You have a lot of sort of intermediate and even in migration, sort of intermediate sort of dynamics that are in place. So mobility has always been part of indigenous Amazonia, whether it's individual or collective mobility. And here I'm using the terminology of residential mobility, which is also, still today when territorial extension allows, common in many areas because of seasonality, because of resource and logistical mobility, for instance, to reach markets or to sort of other kinds of needs. One thing, and then nomadism, and that range between nomadism and sedentism, depending on the area of that you're talking about, the Amazon, it's also very much part of the way, the social organization of the area to delimit that, and that's what I'm kind of getting to the situation today in which enclosures are limiting those kinds of organizational dynamics in the region. So, and of course, limiting significantly, like enclosing areas that used to be much larger areas of mobility because of resources, to confine the space of reservation. One process that is very interesting is that we call multi-sited households, the process that I have studied a lot among riverine Amazonian, which is households that are organized economically in different places. So you have the family still functioning as a family, but you have part of the family that is in the rural area where you have resources and other opportunities, and part of the family who are in urban areas. And sort of serve as a bridge, but it's still the same family. So that kind of, which depend on the geography, you have this mobility between multi-sidedness that can be very frequent or very spaced. But this is a very important part of this equation, because significant number of people who we consider that are living either in urban areas, for instance, or in indigenous areas, are actually moving frequently between places and set up, sort of organizational ways in which they have a base in the city and a base in their lands or in rural areas. And of course, displacement, force and violence continues to be part of the story of Amazonian indigenous and other rural populations. Brazil this year, is ranked second in killings of environmental leaders. Many of them are indigenous, right? So, and the continued expansion and support by many groups of the agricultural frontier and the forest frontier and the mining frontier, right, continue to create situations in which some groups that are less organized are, facing displacement one way or another. So it's a region that is transforming perhaps faster than any other region globally, right? And I want to show this so you see the evolution of roads, the evolution of the red is deforestation, the yellow dots are cities, right? And you see the increasing appearance of indigenous areas, which are shaded in the middle, and protected areas that came also as a reaction to this fast expansion of the frontiers in the region, right? And this is a situation that continues to evolve. So the reality that indigenous people are facing today is, on the one hand, the kinds of pressures that we hear all the time, the pressures that are the commodity types of pressures. I'm gonna go fast here, but there's also, a pressure that is a never-ending pressure of legal change to the constitutional rights that grants indigenous people, land rights. These are some of the law projects or the constitutional change projects, some of which have been, at the National Congress trying to move forward for over 20 years. But always trying a window to move this, and this changed drastically the current constitutional rights of demarcation, of mining, of different kinds of use. So the pressure is not only from commodity frontiers, but a much more deeper pressure of fundamental change in rights. On the other hand, as you see here, you have the demarcated indigenous lands, and here goes Brazil and the basin as a whole. And next to it, you see the demarcation of protected areas, which tend to be more or less sort of next to it. So there has been significant advance in sort of guaranteeing those rights. Actually, as part of a national policy of, on the one hand, promoting deforestation and incentivize deforestation, on the other hand, promoting indigenous land to keep deforestation at a slower pace because of, a number of reasons. Nonetheless, a very important advance, at least for significant numbers of groups. But the scenario, the landscape of indigenous people in the region is a very urban and rural landscape nonetheless, right? So this is the most recent census, and the majority of the population, indigenous population in Brazil, are living away from indigenous lands, like significant majority. These are, sort of households with at least one member of an indigenous person, right? And these are the location of indigenous lands. But so the message here still, most of the indigenous population in Brazil, either don't have land rights or have moved away from indigenous lands. But again, it's a process that we cannot sort of look in a black-white situation. It's a highly connected process of mobility. Even if members of the family migrate more permanently, you're going to have that as a base for mobility, right? Rather than a separation from their original communities. So this, the blue here shows increase in number of indigenous people living inside indigenous land. So that's both sort of demographic growth inside, but also in new lands that have been granted, but also indigenous from urban areas returning back to indigenous lands, which is a process that we see now, including with indigenous youth. So just to sort of starting to wrap up here, the challenges continue to mount. Even though I think indigenous organizations are much well prepared to be a player, to be on the table, to confront this challenge. But significant territorial fragmentation, as I'll mention, I'll give an image of example, air and water pollution affecting indigenous lands throughout the region and affecting Brazil as a whole. The amount of illegal and organized crime that has emerged in this region during the past 5 years has sort of, it's mind-boggling. Right? It has dominated many of those regions and has become the main concern for a lot of communities, in particular for, sort of how do you keep the youth from being co-opted by very large-scale organized crime. Of course, everything else continues, and now the scale of climate change in the region, just in the past 5 years, none of us could anticipate it would be so drastic and so fast. Last year, we had some of the worst drought in the region. Literally, entire rivers went dry and communities are totally isolated. This year is going the same way already now, which is early that season. It's as strong as was last year and have many areas that are totally isolated because of drought and with other problems that are coming. Flammability, this year also we are right now breaking another record in fire in Brazil. São Paulo this week has become the most polluted city globally because of fires in São Paulo and because of fires that are moving from the Amazon and from the Cerrado down. So this is the scenario of governance that many indigenous lands are facing. They are becoming what I call islands of biological and cultural diversity, right? And you find that throughout the southern rim of the Amazon, like across. It's a process that in 10 years has turned these areas into islands. The other process that is happening is also a very invisible process in the way we talk about the Amazon. Most people don't think about the Amazon in terms of as an urban region, which is 80% of the Amazonian population live in cities, is the formation of interurban networks. These are white dots and rows. These are indigenous areas, these islands. So the process that is shaping the future of this region is a process of urban interconnection. right? Which creates then also a different scenario for migration and mobility around indigenous areas. So just to wrap up, I guess I mentioned that already. You have on the one hand threats to territorial rights and killings. That is a very violent situation now. At the same time, they are gaining recognition as sort of the central piece, for the climate change and biodiversity commitments and agreements and goals for the Amazon. Youth voices are emerging strongly in the Amazon. It's one of the areas where we see the most youth leaders emerging around the region. At the same time, this is the population that has faced the biggest pressure from organized crimes and, of course, suffering the most. As I said, the front line for climate extremes. And finally, what I think the point here is that the model of governance that has led to the implementation of indigenous lands to the point that in the Amazon basin, we have near 40%. In Brazil, just indigenous land, we have over 23% of the Amazon. It's a huge area. So that represented a major success, a major advance to guarantee territorial rights. But that mode of governance is now limited by the process of transformation around them, right? So indigenous peoples are doing a great job preserving their territories, preserving their waters, but the impacts are coming from the outside. So that kind of approach to governance that's functioned for some years now needs to be rethought. Otherwise, the areas that are being conserved will be undermined from the outside, being because of pollution, deforestation, or climate, and so forth. So, we need to rethink how, we integrate those areas into the larger region. Thank you. And I forgot about my timer, of course.
Okay, not nice to hear, but important. So thank you very much for this talk. And now we'll move on to Nikolai Alvarado's talk. And it's Urban Informality, Migration and Waste, Spatio-Corporeal Cartographies of Environmental Oppression. He's from the University of Illinois at Urbana, Champaign. Tienes cerca.
Bueno, yo grito de todas formas, así que... Claramente no soy cantante. Ahí está. ¿No estás de aquí? No las puedo pasar aquí también, ¿no?
La toma llega hasta aquí.
¿Qué tengo que estar aquí? Ya. Perfecto. Bueno, con el dolor de mi alma voy a dar esta presentación en inglés porque llegué a Estados Unidos cuando ya tenía 17 años. Toda mi formación es increíble porque uno siempre se queja, ojalá yo pudiera decir todo esto en español, y después cuando hay que decirlo es como, pero solo me sé todo esto en inglés. Así que, bueno, el caso que les presento, lo primero sí se los voy a decir en español, pero el caso que les presento es en Costa Rica. Estamos hablando de migración sur-sur, y parte de mi trabajo tiene que ver con una forma de racismo ambiental que ocurre en comunidades informales. Mi trabajo toma lugar en esta migración sur-sur y sus múltiples articulaciones con paisajes de lo que se puede llamar informalidad urbana, y específicamente tiene que ver con la experiencia de migrantes nicaragüenses viviendo en el que se considera la comunidad migrante y binacional más grande de Centroamérica. ¿Okay? Y voy a cambiar al inglés. And that is the community of La Carpio in San Jose, Costa Rica, established through the occupation of state-owned land in 1993. Nicaraguan migration to Costa Rica is one of the most important south-south migration trajectories within our region, taking place for many decades. Today, Nicaraguans represent close to 7 to 9% of the population in the country. And La Carpio has a population of close to 50,000 people. Now, trash is a daily experience in La Carpio. The main landfill serving the greater metropolitan area of Costa Rica has operated there since 2001. Since then, an ever-increasing number of trash trucks parade through the main road carrying the discarded excess of Costa Rica's urban metabolism and its neoliberal scheme of citizenship through consumption. At least 12 tons of waste flow into La Carpio daily, irrigating the road with liquid traces of decomposing waste. The unrelenting stench emanating from the landfill, particularly from this gas that is a byproduct of decomposing waste that is burned at night, descends onto the settlement regularly. The landfill seems to even determine a sense of topography. It rises as a steep pile of trash that has been amassing for more than 2 decades here in this location, a mountain building process that rivals any other in the Capitalocene. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, redbacks became a common sight. These carry the infectious waste from hospitals, and given the specific time period, most likely linked to the disposal of COVID-related material. Every kind of waste, domestic, industrial, medical, agricultural, is paraded through and dumped in La Carpio, just meters away from houses. Not surprisingly, residents have historically complained of gastrointestinal issues, vomiting, skin rashes, and respiratory illnesses. While Costa Rican authorities condescendingly attribute these pathologies to the unhygienic ways of Nicaraguan migrants who live there, residents attribute them to their coexistence with Costa Rican waste. And I'm not intending to replicate this urban catastrophe genre popular in the literature that describes our cities, as James Holston calls it. But one cannot deny that the material conditions of waste and pollution that exist in La Carpio make it an environmental tragedy that extends and tends to repeat itself across geographies of urban informality, not just in Latin America, but globally. Often, these oppressive environmental conditions are part of the everyday experience of living in places like La Carpio, places that are increasingly becoming territories of inhabitation and operation for a large percentage of South-South migrants in the region. Yet we seldomly look at the processes that render certain bodies and the urban territories they occupy as natural sinks for pollution. So I begin with what has become increasingly evident to me as a Costa Rican first, but also through my involvement in this particular community for the last 8 years, in trying to make sense of the persistent targeting of La Carpio for a number of environmental disamenities. And that is that migrant spaces, such as La Carpio, are symbolically and materially mapped as ontological extensions of each other. So bodies are considered the extension of the spaces they occupy, and the spaces are considered an extension of the bodies that occupy them themselves, okay? So both bodies and spaces are constructed, perceived, intervene, and oppressed, functioning as extensions of each other. environmental suffering in this sense is truly simultaneously a spatial and corporeal form of oppression. So to work through this idea, what I'm trying to propose in my work is the notion of body spaces with a little hyphen there, that you cannot take both separately to understand these instances. Body spaces of migration become this scale through which migrant communities are made into sacrifice zones and assigned disposability to them. Decisions on the location of waste are made on this constructed spatial corporeal cartography of the city that defines proper spaces for the location of waste, including migrants themselves as human waste. In the context, again, of an increasing marked intersection between various forms of permanent migration and geographies of urban informality, these body spaces try to pay attention to geopolitical processes of othering, bordering, and ordering that are simultaneously spatial and corporeal, and operate in our cities through urban and migration regimes that are trying to target this presence of migrants. Now, in 2015, the Costa Rican government located on the other side of La Carpio, the largest wastewater treatment plant in Central America. It treats water from polluted metropolitan rivers and receives sewage with excrement from Costa Rican households. Over 40 tons of domestic solid waste arrives at this facility daily. Meanwhile, residents of La Carpio remain disconnected from this infrastructure located in their backyard, many having to send their own sewage superficially into rivers. So here, trash and excrement remind people of their quite literal embodiment as human waste and their community as, a shithole. Following conceptual work on cuerpo territorio coming from Latin America, and which also makes the case for this ontological coupling of bodies and territories, the pathologies experienced by residents of La Carpio, bodily expressions of living with waste, reaffirm that what is done to the territory is done to the body, and what is done to the body is done to the territory. But for me, this is not only revealed in the experience of oppression and environmental suffering itself, but in the ways in which the capacity to inflict oppression relies on this ontological relationship between the two, between bodies and spaces. So as a scale for intervention without accountability, the body space serves to inflict spatially the violence that is meant to be inflicted on the bodies of Nicaraguan migrants. So to the question of what has made this particular space and these particular bodies the proper location of waste, the answer, in my view, lies in the construction of La Carpio as a spatial corporeal cartography of waste within the urban geography of Costa Rica. And I have time to only begin, although it's only 7 minutes, but I only have time to begin conceptualizing this in the particular case of Costa Rica, which is important. But for me, it is crucial to begin thinking the nation state itself as a spatial corporeal imaginary. It relies on both the notion of an imagined community body and of a territory space that this community body naturally produces as an extension of its own intrinsic embodied qualities. Both the national body and the national territory operate as symbolic and material registers that constitute each other. Sorry. I should have done that. Okay. Relatedly to this, the other is a spatial corporeal other as well. Its abject body properly belonging to the abject spaces that they themselves produce as the spatial manifestation of its own ontological condition. This is important in the case of Costa Rica, as many of you may know. The country has historically constructed itself as the Switzerland of Central America, highlighting inherent traits such as peace, democracy, political stability among its values, which differentiates them from the rest of the region and particularly from Nicaraguans. Territorially, Costa Ricans produce both a civilized nation state with modern formal urban spaces, and on the other hand, a pristine and unspoiled nature, which is the narrative that sustains the tourism industry today. And the centerpiece of this social territorial myth of exceptionality is the racial composition of the country. As the story goes, Costa Ricans, unlike the more supposedly mestizo and indigenous populations of Central America, descend from a reduced number of Spanish families who settled on land with little to no presence of indigenous populations. This is what the story says, or the history that it's told to everyone. So in this sense, whiteness itself is the cornerstone of the spatial corporeal myth of the exceptional nation. In this construction, Nicaraguan spaces and Nicaraguan bodies become the spatial corporeal other through processes of racialization of space and spatialization of race. La Carpio formed in 1993. Dios santo, dije un minuto, no puede ser. 5, ya así. La Carpio formed in 1993 at a conjuncture that saw both challenges to the Costa Rican myth of exceptionality through increasing inequality and a growing presence of a permanent Nicaraguan migration settling at the urban hegemonic core of the country, okay? Or the country's spatial corporeal imaginary, if you will. So a perceived rise in poverty and crime rates were quickly labeled foreign and attributed to the transgression of Nicaraguan bodies. In this sense, the Nicaraguan body became the site of racialized geopolitical bordering through discourses of invasion, pollution, disease, and importation of other social ills, while simultaneously La Carpio became the spatial manifestation and the source of origin for these conditions within the exceptional territory. So the narrative became that to eradicate settlements like La Carpio, the country had to eradicate the presence of the migrant body itself, which naturally produces these spaces. Here then, forms of oppression, including environmental oppression, can operate without accountability at the scale of both bodies and spaces simultaneously as extensions of each other. The work of Carlos Sandoval, a Costa Rican scholar, has helped illuminate this condition that and this role that La Carpio plays. To him, La Carpio is a geographical place, but above all, a symbolic one in which Costa Rican society, quote unquote, disposes all those traits that they do not want to recognize as their own. This process of assigning disposability to specific people and spaces is a key aspect of the construction of these spatial corporeal cartographies of waste. And I do find the idea of the wasteland an important conceptual borrowing. For Tracy Brian Boyles, the wasteland is a spatial interracial signifier that renders an environment and the bodies that inhabit it pollutable. Material waste itself is just another piece of the puzzle of disposability. Mary Douglas, in her work on purity and pollution, argues that matter is considered dirt only when located in the wrong place. Juanita Sundberg also proposes that, quote, the definition of what is dirty depends on a social ordering or a demarcation of boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate locations for substances and materials. So waste, in a sense, has its proper place where it should sit. And so I argue that the construction of La Carpio as a cartography of waste mapped through the body spaces of Nicaraguan migration, dislodged symbolically and materially as a layer existing outside the spatial corporeal imaginary of the nation, render it the appropriate location, not only of symbolic waste, but also by extension of material waste, AKA trash. So I suspect this was the logic at play when zoning was changed without any clear explanation that allowed for the sitting of the landfill just a few meters away from an already established community. La Carpio established in 1993. In 1999, or up until 1999, this was considered the industrial zone of La Uruca, the district where La Carpio is. You can see over there that it says with the little arrow, industrial zone finishes here. It follows one of the main roads there. And in 1999, without consulting anyone, the map was changed. This is the original map up here. La Carpio is here. Everything was declared basically an industrial zone. This allowed for the landfill to be located on this side, and the wastewater treatment plants to be located on this side, and all kinds of industries to just accumulate in this particular space of the city. In an era where everybody was saying you need to take heavy industry away from populations. Yet La Carpio didn't get treated like that. I'm basically done, believe it or not. Okay. So environmental injustice in La Carpio simply, to me, follows the logic of this body space of Nicaraguan migration as itself defined through refuse. What I'm suggesting is that this concept of body space helps to shed light on how spatial corporeal definitions of the other translate into actual corporal cartographies of violence and oppression in our cities, and for racialized migrant communities particularly, including these environmental forms of oppression that are naturalized in migrant territories such as La Carpio, bordered by two of the most polluted rivers, some say in the world, landfill, excrement, and what completes the equation is the human waste that is considered in our country, nicas, which is used as basically an insult, right? To be called a nica. So that's what I got. Thank you very, very much. Minutes.
Thank you very much. That was perfect. Okay, so comments, questions, regrets.
Yeah. Thank you. I greatly enjoyed this session. It was very informative to me. One question for each of you. First of all, for Eduardo, what do you consider, what is your opinion of the pastoral letter of Pope Francis, Querida Amazonia, which had a strong environmental, pro-indigenous approach, but was this just Vatican greenwashing? Is there something there behind it? What was your opinion as an expert of the Vatican's position expressed in Querida Amazonia, no? And to Nikolai, the situation you mentioned reminded me of how the Haitian immigrants have been treated in Tijuana. In Tijuana, the Haitians have been sent to the cerritos, which are by the border. Those of you who know TJ know that there is a big, very undeveloped and basically unhealthy area where the Haitians put their settlements. But the Haitians are very appreciated in Tijuana. They consider that they're there and that they're urbanizing, because now the Haitians are bringing in electricity, sanitation. None of that existed with them. And they're kind of like good migrants because they go where nobody wants to go. And on the other hand, the Venezuelans and TJ are used to go by the bridge. They would protest. They were considered bad migrants. They would say, no, those Venezolanos, they're problematic. But the Haitians, but los Haitianos, they go places where nobody wants to go. We'd rather have the Haitianos than the Venezolanos. I heard that many times in Tijuana. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. I haven't thought about the letter in terms of its impact. It's a great question. Let me step back. I think Laudato Si, right, the encyclica, which was about 10, 12 years ago, maybe, right, the Pope's encyclica. I think that was a significant document to bridge the science of climate change, right, to the community of faith. It was a really important, I think, document to support the science, right, and to make that science accessible and more sort of visible to a very large Catholic community. This letter, I think it had a similar kind of role. I'm not sure how to gauge its effect, but I think it had an effect on, the Amazonian Pact, like the countries that decide to come together to form a pact about, recently to start to look at cross-boundary issues more jointly. And I think it did have an impact on that. But I think it also had an impact on the Catholic base in Amazonia. What we have in Amazonia today, and many of the really important things that are happening today, I talk a lot about problems, but I usually in my talks talk about the good things that are happening there, the initiatives, the mobilization, the bottom-up, efforts. A lot of that comes from a history since the 70s of the liberation theology movement that was doing sort of practical work on the ground, organizing communities, sort of fighting for territorial rights, bringing new projects. So that phase of the Catholic Church in the region actually shaped a lot of the social movements that we have today. That group has very much, lost its force and position in the region with the rise of the evangelical movement in the Amazon, which became dominant in the Amazon. So I think the latter was as much, to sort of energize that large community that has been losing ground, for the past 20 or so years, right? To recognize their role in the region and to reposition them, in face of the growing evangelical movement, which not as a whole, but in parts of the region, they tend to align more closely with the agribusiness industry in some of those larger economies than align with the local communities or indigenous groups. So thank you for the question. I'm going to think about it, but that's a great, really nice point.
Bueno, no sé si tengo mucho que pueda decir. Lo que me llama la atención, qué horrible es escucharse la voz de uno tan duro. Lo que me llama la atención es igual la asociación de el inmigrante con cierto espacio. Los envían a los cerritos y de cierta forma hay un tipo de esa misma asociación entre un cuerpo y un espacio donde pertenecen en los cerros. Más allá de lo que se pueda, más allá de cómo se dibuje el resto de este picture, ¿no? De si lo que se produce, si el tipo de espacio que produce ese cuerpo, más allá de su origen o la idea original de que pertenecían en el cerro, y una posterior apreciación de que en realidad produce un espacio necesario, bueno, ¿no? O esta idea de se modernizan, no sé qué cabrá en toda esta construcción, ¿no? Y eso es para hablarlo con café y un montón de cosas, pero me llama la atención como primera cosa esta asociación, el lugar los mandan a los cerros. Ajá. Bueno, no, hay un espacio donde estos cuerpos pertenecen en esta geografía nueva donde han transgressed, ¿no? Y eso es en los cerros, ¿no? Interesantísimo, voy a seguir buscando sobre esa situación. Gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Vamos a darles un aplauso a nuestros panelistas. Les vamos a entregar, por favor, su diploma. Y muchísimas gracias. Podremos seguir un poco la conversación, pero vamos